On a quiet dirt road in the middle of nowhere, a chance encounter would change everything. Ethan Harris, a 12-year-old boy with a knack for fixing things, didn't think twice when he saw a man stranded with a flat tire. With grease-stained hands and a heart full of kindness, Ethan fixed the problem, refusing a $100 tip with a simple request: just pay it forward. What Ethan didn't know was that the man he helped was no ordinary traveler. And when a sleek black SUV pulled up to his modest home the next day, it brought with it a shocking revelation that would turn his family's world upside down. But before we get into the story, comment below where you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the winding dirt road. Ethan Harris pedaled steadily on his rusty bike, his legs aching just a little from a long day of yard work. The familiar creak of his bike chain kept him company as he made his way home from Mrs. Donnelly's house. She'd paid him a few dollars for clearing out her garden, enough to stash away for a rainy day, or maybe a small treat. Ethan didn't mind the hard work. His family needed every bit of help they could get. His mom, Rebecca, worked double shifts at the local diner, and his older brother, Tony, seemed to float through life without much purpose. Ethan tried to pick up the slack in whatever ways he could: mowing lawns, fixing things, running errands. It wasn't much, but it made him feel useful. As he rounded a bend in the road, something unusual caught his eye. A shiny black luxury car parked awkwardly on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking. It stood out like a sore thumb against the dusty, uneven road. Ethan slowed, curiosity pulling him closer. A man in a gray suit stood next to the car, looking utterly out of place. His jacket was draped over the open car door, and he was holding a jack in one hand and a phone in the other, staring at the flat rear tire like it had personally offended him. Ethan hesitated for a moment. The man didn't look like the kind of person who'd appreciate a kid's help, but Ethan's curiosity won out. He stopped his bike a few feet away, putting one foot on the ground to steady himself. "Need some help?" he called out, his tone casual. The man looked up sharply, his expression equal parts annoyed and skeptical. His face was flushed, and a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "I think I've got it," he said, though the way he was holding the jack suggested otherwise. Ethan didn't leave. He set his bike down and walked closer, squinting at the car. "Looks like your jack's not set right," he said, kneeling down to get a better look. "If you try lifting it like that, the car could slip." The man hesitated, glancing between Ethan and the jack. "You know how to do this?" Ethan grinned. "Sure do. Fixed my mom's car plenty of times. You mind if I give it a shot?" The man stepped back reluctantly, and Ethan got to work. His hands moved quickly and confidently as he adjusted the jack. The man stood silently at first, his phone dangling forgotten in his hand as he watched the boy. "So," Ethan said as he worked, breaking the silence, "what kind of car is this? Looks fancy." "Bentley," the man replied, his tone clipped. Ethan let out a low whistle. "Bet it costs more than my house." That earned a faint chuckle from the man. "Probably," he admitted. Ethan grinned. "Where were you headed?" "I was on my way to a meeting," the man said, glancing at his watch. "But that's probably out the window now." "Better late than never," Ethan said cheerfully. "At least your car's got a spare. Imagine if it didn't." The man's lips twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. Ethan kept talking, mostly to fill the silence, and before long, the flat tire was off and the spare was securely in place. "All set," Ethan said, stepping back and wiping his hands on his jeans. The man nodded, clearly impressed. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Here," he said, holding it out, "for your trouble." Ethan blinked at the bill but quickly shook his head. "I didn't do it for money," he said simply. The man frowned. "Why'd you do it then?" Ethan shrugged. "My mom says we help people because it's the right thing to do." For the first time, the man seemed at a loss for words. He stared at Ethan for a moment before tucking the bill back into his wallet. "What's your name, kid?" "Ethan," he said, extending his hand. "Ethan Harris." The man clasped his hand firmly. "Well, Ethan Harris," he said, his tone softer now. "I'm Victor Steele. Thank you." No problem, Mr. Steele, Ethan said, hopping back onto his bike. Just pay it forward. Victor watched as the boy pedaled away, disappearing down the dirt road. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at the empty stretch of road ahead. Just pay it forward, he muttered to himself, the words lingering in his mind. Victor got back into his car and started the engine. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, a sense that this brief encounter had shifted something inside him. The boy hadn't wanted money, hadn't even wanted thanks. He'd just helped because he could. Victor couldn't remember the last time he'd seen someone do that. And for the first time in years, he found himself thinking about where he'd come from and what he'd lost along the way. Morning in the Harris household was always a whirlwind of chaos. The kitchen buzzed with the sound of clattering dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, and Tony's muffled music leaking from his earbuds as he lounged on the couch. Ethan sat at the wobbly kitchen table, spooning cereal into his mouth, while flipping through a magazine about DIY repairs he'd borrowed from the library. Near the sink, Rebecca packed her lunch into a reusable grocery bag, leftovers from the previous night's dinner, and a thermos of coffee. She glanced at the clock above the stove and sighed. Tony, are you planning to do anything useful today? Tony didn't even look up. Depends on your definition of useful. Rebecca muttered something under her breath, shaking her head, and grabbed her keys from the counter. Suddenly, Tony sat up straight, his phone slipping from his hands. He peered out the window, his face a mix of confusion and excitement. There's a black SUV outside, he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the morning clatter. Ethan looked up, mid-spoonful. What? Big shiny SUV, Tony continued, getting to his feet. And some guy in a suit just got out. Looks like he's heading this way. Rebecca frowned, drying her hands on a dish towel. What are you talking about? She moved to the window, her face tightening as she caught sight of the vehicle parked in their gravel driveway. The contrast between the luxury car and their modest home was almost comical. Do you know him? Tony asked, smirking. Mom's got a secret rich boyfriend. Don't start, Tony, Rebecca snapped, already walking toward the door. She hesitated for a second before opening it, revealing a tall man in a tailored suit standing on their creaky wooden porch. Mrs. Harris? He asked, his voice polite but firm. Yes, Rebecca replied cautiously, her hand gripping the doorknob. The man smiled faintly, his expression sincere but slightly uneasy. I'm Victor Steele. I'm here to thank your son. Rebecca blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Victor adjusted his stance, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. Your son, Ethan. He helped me yesterday when my car broke down. I wanted to thank him properly. Ethan had been watching from the table, but at the mention of his name, he scrambled out of his chair and rushed to the door. Mr. Steele, he exclaimed, his face lighting up. What are you doing here? Victor's smile softened at the sight of Ethan. I wanted to let you know how much your kindness meant to me, he said. It's not every day you meet someone willing to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. Rebecca's brow furrowed as she glanced between her son and the sharply dressed man. Ethan, you know this? Mr. Steele? Yeah, Mom, Ethan said, turning to her. He had a flat tire yesterday, so I helped him out. Rebecca folded her arms, her protective instincts kicking in. Well, that's nice, but you didn't have to come all this way, Mr. Steele. I know, Victor replied, his tone measured. But I felt it was important. Your son reminded me of something I'd forgotten, how a small act of kindness can mean a lot. Rebecca didn't relax. We don't need anything from you, she said firmly. I'm not here to impose, Victor assured her, holding up a hand. I just wanted to express my gratitude. From his pocket, Victor pulled out a sleek black business card and handed it to Ethan. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Ethan took the card, his fingers brushing over the embossed silver lettering. Thanks, Mr. Steele, he said with a shy grin. Victor glanced at Rebecca, nodding respectfully. Thank you for raising a son who understands the value of kindness. Rebecca didn't respond, her expression unreadable. Victor gave a small nod and turned, walking back to the SUV. The vehicle's engine hummed to life, and moments later, it was gone. leaving behind a cloud of dust and a family full of questions. Rebecca closed the door, her lips pressed into a thin line as she turned to Ethan. "What exactly did you do to get a millionaire's attention?" "I just fixed his tire, Mom," Ethan said with a shrug, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Rebecca frowned. "And now he's showing up at our house? That doesn't seem strange to you?" "Not really," Ethan said, examining the business card. "I guess he just wanted to say thanks." Tony snorted from the couch. "Rich guys don't just say thanks. Bet he's looking to buy something. Maybe the whole town." Rebecca shot him a glare. "You're not helping, Tony." "What?" Tony said, holding up his hands. "I'm just saying it's weird." "It's not weird," Ethan said defensively. "He's just a nice guy. He even offered me money, but I didn't take it." "You didn't take it?" Tony's jaw dropped. "Are you insane? How much?" $100, Ethan said casually. Tony groaned. "Ethan, do you know how many games I could buy with that?" "It's not about the money," Ethan said, rolling his eyes. "I helped him because he needed it, not because I wanted something." Rebecca watched her younger son carefully, her skepticism warring with a flicker of pride. "You did a good thing, Ethan," she said finally, her voice softening. "But just be careful, okay? People like that don't always have pure motives." Ethan nodded, though he didn't entirely understand her concern. "Okay, Mom." As the morning went on, the tension eased, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Steele's visit was more than a simple thank you. Something about his demeanor, the way he'd looked at Ethan, the way he'd spoken about kindness, lingered in her mind. And though Ethan seemed content to let the whole thing go, Rebecca knew better. Rich men didn't show up unannounced without a reason. She just hoped that reason wouldn't disrupt the fragile balance of their lives. The Harris household wasn't known for drawing attention. Nestled at the end of a dusty lane, their small home blended into the fabric of the quiet, working-class town. But after the sleek black SUV pulled into their driveway and the sharply dressed Victor Steele stepped out, word spread like wildfire. At the diner where Rebecca worked, the whispers started as soon as she clocked in for her shift. She barely had time to tie her apron before hearing snippets of conversation from her regulars. "Did you see that car at Rebecca's place yesterday?" Mrs. Granger, a town gossip, said over her coffee. "Must have cost more than this whole block." "What do you think it was about?" Mr. Perkins asked, leaning over the counter conspiratorially. "Maybe she's got herself a rich admirer." Rebecca, wiping down the counter nearby, stiffened but didn't look up. "Bet it's a sugar daddy," someone joked from a nearby booth, drawing a few chuckles. The words stung, but Rebecca forced herself to keep her head down and her expression neutral. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. As the day wore on, the comments became harder to ignore. Even the kitchen staff couldn't resist throwing in their theories. "Hey, Rebecca," one of the cooks called as she picked up an order. "Should we expect you to roll up in a Bentley next week?" Rebecca gave him a tight smile. "Sure, right after I win the lottery." But inside, the rumors gnawed at her. By the time she got home that evening, Rebecca's nerves were frayed. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of Ethan tinkering with something in the backyard. She leaned against the kitchen counter, closing her eyes and trying to let go of the day's tension. Tony walked in a few minutes later, tossing his keys onto the table. "You hear about the circus you started?" he said, smirking. Rebecca shot him a look. "Don't start, Tony." "I'm serious," he said, flopping into a chair. "People are talking, Mom. Everyone at the gas station thinks you've got some kind of secret deal going with that rich guy." Rebecca exhaled sharply. "Let them talk. I don't care." Tony leaned back, crossing his arms. "Maybe you should. Stuff like this doesn't happen in a place like this. Rich guys don't just show up for no reason." At that moment, Ethan came through the back door, wiping his hands on a rag. "What doesn't happen?" he asked, looking between his mom and brother. "Apparently, your little tire-fixing adventure has the whole town talking," Tony said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan frowned. "Why? He just wanted to thank me." "Yeah, well, people don't see it that way," Tony replied. "They think it's weird. And weird doesn't go unnoticed around here." Ethan turned to Rebecca, who was now pouring herself a cup of tea. "Mom, you don't believe that, do you?" Rebecca set the teapot down with a bit more force than necessary. I don't know what to believe, Ethan. I just know we don't need strangers poking around in our lives. Mom, he wasn't trying to poke around, Ethan insisted. He was just saying thank you. That's it. Rebecca sighed, rubbing her temples. Maybe. But it doesn't stop people from talking, does it? The next day, the rumors followed Ethan to school. As he parked his bike in the rack, he noticed a group of kids whispering and shooting glances in his direction. By the time he sat down in class, he could hear the snickers and murmurs. Hey, Ethan, one boy said during a break. Your new dad pick you up in that fancy car yet? He's not my dad, Ethan muttered, feeling his cheeks heat up. Sure, another kid chimed in, grinning. Bet he bought you something, though. What was it, a new bike? A PlayStation? Ethan clenched his fists. He didn't buy me anything. I helped him fix his tire, that's all. But his protests only seemed to make them laugh harder. At lunch, he sat alone, poking at his sandwich. The doubt Tony had planted in his mind the day before began to grow. What if his brother was right? What if Victor Steele wasn't just a nice guy? That evening, the tension in the Harris house reached a boiling point. Rebecca was at the stove, stirring a pot of spaghetti, while Tony sat at the table scrolling on his phone. Looks like your new buddy's got a Wikipedia page, Tony said, holding up his phone. Victor Steele, real estate mogul, worth millions. What's he doing hanging out in a place like this? Ethan, sitting on the floor with his tools spread out around him, looked up sharply. He wasn't hanging out. I told you, I just helped him with his car. Tony raised an eyebrow. And then he shows up at our house in a car that probably costs more than your life savings? That doesn't scream just a thank you. Rebecca turned from the stove, her eyes narrowing. Tony, enough. I'm just saying, Tony said, holding up his hands. It's weird, and you know it. It's only weird because people like you keep making it weird, Ethan shot back, his voice rising. Tony smirked. Relax, little bro. I'm just pointing out the obvious. Ethan slammed his wrench onto the floor, standing up. You don't know anything about him. He's not some creepy rich guy, okay? He's nice. He didn't have to come back and thank me, but he did. What's so wrong with that? Ethan, Rebecca said softly, but he turned to her, his frustration spilling over. Mom, you believe me, right? You believe he's not trying to mess with us? Rebecca hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wanted to reassure him, but the weight of the rumors and her own doubts held her back. Ethan's shoulders slumped. You don't, he said quietly, his voice filled with hurt. Ethan, it's not that, Rebecca began, stepping toward him. I don't trust people like him. I've seen too many smooth talkers with too much money come into places like this and leave a mess behind. I'm trying to protect us. You don't need to protect us from him, Ethan said, grabbing his tools. He's not like that. He stomped off to his room, slamming the door behind him. The house was silent after that. Rebecca finished making dinner, but no one ate together. Tony disappeared into his room, muttering something about small-town drama. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from her untouched plate. She hated how the situation had spiraled. She hated the rumors, the tension, and most of all, the doubt she saw in Ethan's eyes. Victor Steele had left their lives as quickly as he'd entered, but the ripples he'd caused were far from settling. And deep down, Rebecca wondered if they ever would. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of the Harris kitchen, highlighting the modest but well-loved room. Rebecca stood by the sink, rinsing out her coffee cup. The previous day's events still lingered in her mind. The whispers, the tension at home, Ethan's frustration. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't hear the crunch of gravel in the driveway. When she glanced out the window, her stomach tightened. The black SUV was back, sleek and out of place against the backdrop of their weathered yard. This time, Victor Steele wasn't alone. A woman in a tailored business suit, clutching a leather folder, stepped out behind him. Rebecca wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door as they approached. Her expression was guarded, her tone clipped. Mr. Steele, this is getting excessive. Victor smiled warmly, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. I promise, this will be my last visit. May we come in? Rebecca hesitated, glancing back into the house where Ethan and Tony were still finishing breakfast. Finally, with a sigh, she stepped aside. "All right, come in." Victor and his associate entered, their polished appearances contrasting sharply with the simple home. They sat at the kitchen table, Victor easing into a chair like he belonged there, while the woman placed the leather folder in front of her. Ethan appeared from the hallway, his face lighting up when he saw Victor. "Mr. Steele, what are you doing here?" Victor smiled, nodding to the boy. "Good morning, Ethan." He then turned his attention to Rebecca, who remained standing, arms crossed. "I came to share something important." Rebecca sat down slowly, her expression skeptical. "All right, let's hear it." Victor leaned forward, his tone sincere. "Ethan's act of kindness reminded me of where I came from. I grew up in a neighborhood like this. Not much money, not many opportunities. My parents worked hard, but life was a struggle. I worked my way up, but in the process, I lost sight of what really matters. Helping others, staying connected to where you come from." Rebecca's brow furrowed, her guard softening slightly as she listened. Tony, who had been leaning against the doorframe with a smirk, looked less amused now. Victor continued, gesturing to the leather folder. "Yesterday, I left here thinking about what I could do to honor Ethan's kindness, and I realized the best way to repay him is by paying it forward." He slid the folder across the table toward Rebecca. "This is the deed to your house. It's paid off." Rebecca froze, her eyes widening. "What?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper as she stared at the folder. Victor nodded. "You don't have to worry about mortgage payments anymore. The house is yours, free and clear." Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. I I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because your son inspired me," Victor said simply. "But that's not all." He glanced at the woman who opened the folder and placed another document on top. "I've also set up a scholarship fund in Ethan's name. It's for kids in this community who deserve opportunities they might not otherwise get. It'll cover things like tuition, school supplies, extracurricular programs. It's a chance for kids here to dream bigger." Ethan's eyes widened, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You didn't have to do that." Victor smiled at him. "I wanted to. What you did for me yesterday wasn't just a favor. It was a reminder that even small acts of kindness can make a huge difference. This is my way of continuing that ripple." Rebecca shook her head, tears streaming down her face. This is too much. We can't accept this." Victor's smile didn't waver. "You already have, Mrs. Harris. Thank your son." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the sound of Rebecca's quiet sobs. Tony shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Ethan, who stood frozen, staring at the papers on the table. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice trembling. "Ethan, do you understand what this means? What you've done?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything, Mom. I just helped him with his tire." "And that one small thing," Victor said, leaning forward, "reminded me of the kind of person I want to be. Your kindness had a ripple effect, Ethan. That's what this is about." Rebecca reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're the best thing to ever happen to this family," she said through her tears. Tony, still leaning against the doorframe, finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "So, this is real? No strings, no catch?" Victor looked at him, his expression serious. "No strings, just a chance to do some good." Tony nodded, his usual sarcasm absent. "All right then." After Victor and his associate left, the Harris family sat in stunned silence, staring at the folder on the table. The weight of what had just happened slowly began to sink in. Rebecca reached for the deed with trembling hands. "I never thought we'd see something like this. I don't know how to thank him." Ethan looked down at the business card Victor had given him the day before, now sitting next to the folder. "I guess we don't have to. He said it was about paying it forward." Rebecca wiped her eyes and gave him a watery smile. "And I think we'd better start figuring out how to do that." That night, for the first time in years, the Harris family went to bed without the weight of bills and worries hanging over them. Rebecca lay awake for a long time, thinking about how one small act of kindness from her son had sparked such a profound change in their lives. And Ethan, lying in his small room, stared at the ceiling, wondering how he could ever repay the world for what Victor had done. But deep down, he knew the answer. By following the same lesson his mom had always taught him, helping others simply because it's the right thing to do. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.